They say the full moon is when the walls between worlds grow thin, when the things that live in shadow finally step into the light. What they never tell you, what nobody ever puts in the warning, is that sometimes the most dangerous thing in the dark isn't a monster at all. Sometimes it's the pull you feel toward one. My name is Elara Voss, 26 years old, field botanist. Completely, aggressively ordinary, or so I believed, right up until the night I stepped past an iron boundary marker into Ashgrove territory and felt the world tilt beneath my feet like a compass suddenly finding north. I didn't know then what that shift meant. I didn't know about fated mates, or pack bonds, or the ancient law that said once a wolf recognized his mate on his territory, everything that followed was already written. I didn't know about Cassian Wolfe at all. I know now. This is the story of how I crossed one line, just one small surveying boundary in a forest I had no business being in, and ended up somewhere I have never once wanted to leave. This is the story of the alpha who found me on his land and couldn't bring himself to send me away. Of a pack who slowly, grudgingly, astonishingly made room for a human who collected mushroom samples and asked too many questions. Of a blood moon that forced a choice neither of us should have had to make. And this is the story of the Heartlight, the oldest, rarest thing in all of Ashgrove territory, that bloomed brighter the night I arrived than it had in living memory, which probably should have been my first clue. But I'm a scientist. I don't believe in clues. I believe in evidence. The evidence, as it turned out, was overwhelming. The Pacific Northwest research grant had arrived in Elara's inbox on a Tuesday in March, and she had accepted it before she finished reading the terms and conditions, which, looking back, was very on-brand. 6 months of solo fieldwork. Rare bioluminescent fungi. A cabin rental covered by the university. No colleagues, no open-plan offices, no well-meaning people asking why she was still single. It had sounded, she told her sister over the phone, like a gift from the universe. Her sister had told her the universe didn't give gifts. It gave tests with very elaborate setup. Her sister, as it turned out, had a point. The highest density sighting coordinates for Pinella stypticus, the fungal species she'd come to document, were clustered in a 30-square-mile stretch of old-growth forest on the eastern edge of the mapped study zone. The problem was that every single one of those coordinates sat past a property boundary marked on the survey maps with a thick black line and a notation that read, Ashgrove. Private. No access. In person, it was even less welcoming. 2 ancient pines flanked the entry point, a twisted rope of black iron threaded between them, and a hand-painted sign that said, Ashgrove territory. Trespassers will be dealt with. No please. No have a nice day. Just will be dealt with, in capital letters, like whoever had painted it had wanted to make absolutely sure the message landed. Elara had stood at that boundary for a long time on a cold October night, headlamp casting its pale circle against the dark, and argued with herself. She was a professional. She had ethics. She believed in respecting private property. She also hadn't driven 400 miles and written a 12-page research proposal to turn around because of a sign. It's just fungi, she told herself. You cross, you sample, you leave. No one even needs to know. She stepped past the boundary marker. The air changed the instant her boot crossed the line, a pressure, subtle but unmistakable, like descending underwater. Like something vast had just turned its full, unhurried attention toward her. She told herself it was the altitude. Low blood sugar. The particular quality of forest air after 9 p.m. Then the forest went silent. Not the gradual quiet of animals settling. Immediate. Absolute. Like someone had pressed a switch. Elara stood very still and listened to the sound of her own heartbeat. He stepped out of the trees like he'd been poured from them. 6 feet 4, maybe more. Dark hair pushed back carelessly from a face that had no business being that angular and severe and still, somehow, devastating. He was wearing a gray Henley rolled to his forearms despite the October cold, jeans, no coat, as though the temperature were a personal insult he'd chosen to ignore. His arms were crossed. His jaw was set like quarried stone. His eyes, which should have been ordinary gray in the dark, caught what little moonlight filtered through the canopy, and held it. Just a fraction too long. Just a fraction too bright. He was, Elara registered with a disproportionate corner of her brain, objectively the most striking person she had ever encountered in her life. He was also clearly furious. "You're on private land," he said. Not a question. Not an invitation to explain. A statement delivered with the flat certainty of someone who did not make a habit of repeating himself. Elara's prepared speech about research permits and university credentials and the documented scientific importance of bioluminescent mycological study came out in one breathless, scrambling rush. She watched his expression not change at all, not soften, not shift, not grant her so much as a millimeter of ground. He just watched her with those two bright eyes and waited for her to run out of words. When she did, he said simply, "Turn around. Walk back the way you came. Don't return." "Understood," Elara said. "I'm going. Is there any possibility of a formal research access permit? The university could provide credentials, a full liability waiver. I need only 2 mornings a week, no more than 3 hours per." "No," Cassian said. He said it the way mountains existed, without apology or negotiation. Final. But he was looking at her with something she couldn't quite read. Not just the anger, something underneath it. A look she would later come to understand was the particular expression of a man encountering something that refused to fit any category he'd prepared. She didn't know then that the moment she'd crossed the boundary, his breath had gone shallow. That something in him had lurched sideways like a compass dropped near a magnet. She didn't know that in his world, that sensation had a name. All she knew was that he was staring at her like a problem he hadn't expected, and that she should absolutely, immediately leave. She turned to go. She genuinely meant it. Then the ground 3 feet to her left detonated. That was the only word for it, the eruption of undergrowth, the crash of something enormous displacing the night, and a sound that did not belong in any register she associated with animals or forests or anything she'd encountered in 12 years of fieldwork. A sound that was ancient and enormous and came from somewhere that made the back of her spine go cold. Elara did not scream. She considered it and then decided against it and stood absolutely still. "Don't move," the man said. His voice had changed. The controlled quiet was gone, replaced by something sharper and more complete. The voice, she realized later, of something that outranked every other living thing in this forest. From the dark between the trees, 2 eyes appeared. Amber, luminous, low to the ground, but low in the way something crouching is low. Something choosing. Then it came into the moonlight. Elara's brain offered the word wolf. Her eyes sent back a strongly worded objection. Wolves, her brain countered, do not come the size of draft horses. Wolves do not move with the fluid, half-translated musculature of something not entirely animal. Wolves do not look at a person with the particular, assessing, disturbingly intelligent quality of something deciding what it thinks of you. This wolf did all 3. "Reese," the man said. "Quiet. Absolute. Stand down." The enormous wolf went still. Its amber gaze slid from Elara to the man and held there, something passing between them that had no language she could identify. Then it sat, precisely and deliberately, like an animal being cooperative in the most pointed way possible. That, Elara said, because her mouth had apparently decided it was done waiting for her brain to catch up, is not a normal wolf. "No," the man agreed. "It isn't. Which is exactly why you should not come back here." He turned those impossible eyes to her fully. "Do you understand me?" Elara looked at the wolf. She looked at the man. She looked at the way the moonlight caught his eyes and turned them, just for a fraction of a second, the same amber as the wolf's. "I understand," she said. She walked back to the boundary line, crossed it, and did not run. She was extremely proud of not running. What she didn't say as she left, she was going to be back within 48 hours. Because whatever was happening in that forest, whatever those creatures were, whatever that look in the man's eyes had meant, it was the most extraordinary thing she had encountered in 12 years of chasing extraordinary things. And Elara Voss had never, not once, been able to walk away from extraordinary. The town of Millhaven sat at the edge of Ashgrove territory like a buffer zone. 800 people, 1 diner, one general store, and a bar called the Wayward Pine that smelled of pine resin and old decisions. Elara had rented a cabin on the eastern edge from a woman named Mrs. Harlow, who had the energy of someone who had seen things and chosen not to talk about them. Her move-in instructions had been specific. "Stay on the marked trails," Mrs. Harlow had said, handing over the keys without looking up from her tea. "Don't go east after dark. And if one of the Ashgrove folk speaks to you, be polite, be brief, and don't ask questions." "What's wrong with asking questions?" Elara had asked. Mrs. Harlow had looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone watching a person walk toward a very obvious puddle. "Nothing," the old woman said, "if you're not fond of the answers." That first night, Elara spread her field maps across the kitchen table and told herself she was analyzing the mycological data. She was not analyzing the mycological data. She was thinking about a man with gray eyes that caught the moonlight wrong. About a wolf the size of a horse, sitting down on command. About the way the forest had gone silent the moment she'd crossed an iron rope and the pressure in her chest that had come with it. Not fear, which would have made sense, but something else. Something she had no taxonomic category for. The research data was interesting, though, when she did look at it. The bioluminescent sighting clusters weren't random. They spiraled outward from a central point, roughly 3 miles inside Ashgrove territory, as if something at that center was feeding them, nourishing them. Her researcher brain said, anomalous growth pattern, possible underground mineral deposit, significant scientific value, must investigate. The rest of her said something that wasn't a thought. It was a pull, a current, the directional certainty of a compass needle. She sat on her hands and drank terrible instant coffee and informed herself, firmly, that she was not going back that night. She did not go back that night. She went back the following morning at 5 a.m., which she felt was a reasonable compromise. The pre-dawn forest was all mist and half-light, and the particular silence of the hour before birds. Elara crossed the boundary with a full sample kit, her university credentials in her jacket pocket, and a prepared speech she had genuinely practiced in the car. She made it 40 meters before he appeared. He came out of the mist the same way he'd come out of the dark, like the forest had simply decided to produce him. He looked like he hadn't slept. He also looked like he was going to be deeply uncooperative about admitting that. "You came back," Cassian said. "I have a research speech," Elara told him. "Would you like to hear it?" "No," he said. "It's quite good. I practiced it in the car." Something moved in his jaw. Elara was fairly sure it was the effort of not responding to that. "Why did you come back?" he said. Not warmly. Still not a question, more like a man who wanted the honest answer and was tired of waiting for it. "I told you the specimen density passed your boundary line." "The truth," Cassian said. That stopped her. Because the truth was sitting right there in her chest, plain as anything. That pull, that current, the sensation of something unfinished that had kept her awake all night. And he was looking at her with those gray eyes like he already knew. Like he was simply waiting to find out whether she'd say it. "I don't know why I came back," Elara said slowly. "I tried not to. I wasn't going to." Cassian was quiet for a moment. Then, in a voice that was several degrees quieter than the one he'd been using, he said, "I know." "You know? I tried to not be here either," he said. The words sounded like they cost him something. They looked at each other in the mist. Something had shifted in the air between them. Not dramatically, not with music swelling and declarations made. Just a small, irrevocable acknowledgement of something real. He cleared his throat. The controlled authority came back, but it sat differently now, a little less comfortable on him. "If I allow supervised access," he said, "scheduled on my terms, will you stop crossing the boundary unsanctioned?" "Immediately and completely," Elara agreed. "Dawn. Tuesdays and Thursdays. Eastern boundary marker. You stay in areas I designate. You ask before you touch anything." Agreed. He looked at her for another beat. That look again, the one she couldn't categorize. "You're not afraid of us," he said. "Should I be?" Elara asked. Cassian was quiet for long enough that she thought that was her answer. Then he said, "Most people are." "I'm not most people," Elara said. He held her gaze one moment longer. Then he turned and walked into the trees, and she followed, and the mist closed behind them both. She didn't know it, walking behind him in that pale early light, but she would never see the forest as ordinary again. He led her without speaking, and she followed without asking him to slow down, and somewhere in the first 20 minutes of walking she understood that this was a kind of test. Not a malicious one. Just the particular assessment of a person who trusted actions more than promises. She kept pace. She didn't stumble. She didn't complain about the cold. She did notice things. The way he moved, too smooth, nothing wasted. Every step placed with a precision that didn't read as careful so much as completely natural, as if the forest floor were cooperating. The way his head would tilt fractionally before they changed direction, hearing things she couldn't. The way, twice, he simply extended one arm to stop her walking, quiet, automatic, and something enormous moved through the undergrowth 50 meters away, and he tracked it without looking away from her face. On the second time, Elara said, "Can I ask something?" "You're going to regardless," Cassian replied, and she thought, she was almost sure, that there was something very dry and almost amused in his voice. "The people in your territory," she said. "Are they all like you?" "Wolves," he said. Not a correction, just a completion. As if he'd been waiting for her to get there. "I was going to say that, yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then, with the economy of someone used to giving only the information required, pack territory, pack members, mates and children, some born wolves, some turned, 63 of us total. "And you're the alpha?"
"Yes."
"What does that mean? For you, personally?" He walked for long enough that she thought he'd decided not to answer. Then he said, "It means every decision I make for 63 people. Every risk I take, they carry. Every vulnerability I show becomes a door someone might try to break through." He stopped walking. They had reached the clearing, and Elara forgot every question she'd been about to ask. The entire floor of the clearing was alive with light. Not the flat, static light of electronics or laboratory equipment. Living light, pulsing, breathing, blue-green and luminous, rising from thousands of fungi that ranged from thumbnail size to dinner plate wide, spreading across the ground in rings within rings within rings. Each one glowing. Each one part of a pattern so intricate and deliberate that for a moment Elara's brain couldn't process it as natural. At the center of all of it stood an ancient oak, its roots half emerged from the earth like reaching hands, and from beneath those roots the light was brightest, a deep, warm pulse, almost like a heartbeat. "Oh my God," Elara whispered. She was not a person who whispered. She noted this about herself, distantly, with the part of her brain not currently overwhelmed. "How long has this been here?" she asked. "As long as the pack has been on this land," Cassian said. His voice had changed, not softer, exactly, but less defended. "Longer, maybe. Pack lore says it's tied to the territory's health. When the pack thrives, it grows. Does it always glow like this?"
"No," he said.
He was looking at the light, not at her. "Only when the territory's boundary is at full strength. When it recognizes something." He paused. "Our lore calls it the heartlight. It means the land welcomes a presence." Elara looked down at the rings of luminescence spreading out from the ancient oak. She looked at the way the light was brightest near her feet. "It's glowing right now," she said. "Yes," Cassian said. "Is that normal?" There was a pause. When he finally answered, his voice was very careful and very quiet. "No," he said. "It isn't." She looked at him.
He was still looking at the light.
Neither of them said anything else. But something had been acknowledged, wordlessly and irrevocably, that both of them would spend the next several weeks pretending they hadn't noticed. She was cataloging her third sample when the others arrived. Reese came first, the wolf from her first night, human now, dark-skinned and tall, with watchful eyes and the posture of someone who had decided to be diplomatic and found it effortful. He introduced himself with his name and his role, Cassian second, and gave her a look that was thorough enough to be nearly uncomfortable. Then a woman, compact, sharp-featured, auburn hair cut close to her head, who assessed Elara with the brisk, unsentimental attention of someone running a diagnostic. Nadia, the woman said. Pack healer. If you sustain any injury on territory, come to me before any human clinic. Our land has specific biological properties your medicine doesn't account for. Understood, Elara said. And you? She was looking at the third arrival, a teenage boy, gangly and bright-eyed and practically vibrating with the contained energy of someone who had been told to wait and was doing a terrible job of it.
Kit, he announced.
I'm 14. I've never met an actual human researcher before, and I have approximately 600 questions, starting with, is it true that humans can't smell emotions? Like, at all? Isn't that completely terrifying? How do you know when someone's lying to you? We mostly just guess, Elara said. Kit stared at her. That sounds exhausting, he said, with the complete sincerity of someone who had just received genuinely distressing information. It really is, Elara agreed. She heard it behind her, a breath, barely a sound. She glanced at Cassian. He was looking at the middle distance with the expression of a man who was absolutely not smiling. He was definitely almost smiling. She stored that away, quietly, like a pressed flower between pages. Evidence of something she wasn't ready to name yet. The weeks that followed were, Elara thought later, the kind of weeks that look ordinary from the outside and are actually everything. Tuesday and Thursday, dawn, eastern boundary. He was always there before her, standing in whatever the morning offered, frost, rain, low gray mist, with the patience of someone for whom waiting was not wasted time but simply a different form of attention. He showed her the territory in pieces. The eastern watershed, where the water ran silver-cold over black stones and the fungi grew in the spray mist along the banks. The high ridge where the rock broke through the treeline, and you could see 50 miles of old-growth forest rolling out below like a breathing thing. The buried foundations in the north that had been there longer than the pack's memory.
He talked.
Not easily. Each piece of information offered like something carefully chosen from a guarded inventory, but steadily. About the pack. About the weight of protecting 63 lives. About decisions he'd made that had cost him, and the ones he'd made that had cost others more. Elara talked back. About her research. About her father, who had been a field botanist and had taken her on her first survey at age 7, and who had died when she was 20 and left her a collection of field notebooks she still carried everywhere. About her habit of collecting moments, not objects, but the specific look of a place at a particular slant of light. The exact sound of forest, made the minute before rain. You remember things precisely, Cassian said once, not quite a question. I'm a cataloger, Elara said. I notice things. I file them. He looked at her in a way that suggested he understood that better than most people would. Kit ambushed the sessions whenever he could, firing questions at Elara with the relentless enthusiasm of someone who had found a new and fascinating subject and intended to document it thoroughly. Elara answered every one. Cassian periodically said Kit's name in a single flat syllable, and Kit periodically ignored it completely. One Tuesday, as Elara was packing her sample cases, Kit announced brightly that Elara had now been to 12 countries for research, which was 12 more than Cassian had been to, which meant Elara had objectively seen more of the world, which he offered as evidence of the tragedy of the alpha lifestyle. Pack alphas don't travel, Cassian said, his tone indicating this was not a subject he required sympathy about. That sounds terrible, Kit said, cheerfully. Thank you, Kit, Cassian said. Elara snapped her case closed and said, without thinking about it, I'll bring you back a field sample from wherever I go next. She'd said it to Kit. But she was looking at Cassian. Kit lit up and said something enthusiastic that she didn't hear, because Cassian had gone very still across the clearing. Wherever you go next, he said. Quiet. Not accusing. Something else. My grant runs through autumn, Elara said carefully. That was always the... I know, he said. 2 words. But the weight in them was not 2 words worth. He turned before she could see his face, and she let him, and neither of them said anything else. She thought about it for 4 days. It was a Thursday when Nadia decided to stop being subtle. Cassian had been called to the northern boundary, a lone wolf passing through, something territorial that required the alpha's presence. Nadia stayed behind to observe, she said. Elara had worked with her enough by then to know that when Nadia said she was observing, she was actually preparing to say something she'd been building toward for some time. They were in the Heartlight clearing. The fungi pulsed around them in the gray morning. Nadia crouched by the outer ring and said, without preamble, "You know what a fated mate is."
"I've researched it," Elara said.
"Then you know it's not something that develops," Nadia said. "It isn't compatibility or attraction or shared interests. It's recognition. The kind that happens once, instantly, and then everything else is just the person deciding what to do about it." She paused. "The night you crossed the boundary." The first night. He knew. Elara kept her eyes on the sampled jar she was labeling. "He hasn't said anything." "Because he believes you're leaving," Nadia said. "Because he spent 5 years after his last Alpha Challenge rebuilding this pack from the ground up, and he will not ask you to stay for him when he doesn't know if you'd want to. Because Cassian Wolfe would carry a wound silently for the rest of his life before he'd let the pack see him ask for something he might not get." The forest was very quiet. "He doesn't need to ask," Elara said. Nadia looked at her. Something in her expression shifted. Not surprise, exactly. More like relief. "Then maybe," Nadia said carefully, "tell him that. Before autumn. Before you leave, and he spends the rest of his life scenting your absence on the wind." She stood. "Mates are rare. Humans who can handle the truth of what we are rarer. And a human who makes the Heartlight respond the way you do." She glanced at the pulsing ground at their feet, brighter than usual, as it always was when Elara was present. "That has happened exactly once. In our entire recorded history." She walked away across the clearing, unhurried, leaving Elara sitting in the blue-green light with a lot to think about. She was still in the clearing an hour later when Cassian came back. The rain had started 20 minutes in. Heavy, October cold, soaking through her jacket in minutes. She'd stayed anyway because she thought better in the rain, and because she needed to think. He found her sitting against the base of the ancient oak, the Heartlight pulsing around her in the dark, rain running down her face like she'd simply decided weather was someone else's problem. He stopped at the edge of the clearing. "You're drenched," he said. "I was thinking," Elara said. "In the rain," he observed. "I think better in the rain." There was a pause. Then, to her surprise, he crossed the clearing and sat down beside her. Not a careful distance away. Beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating off him despite the cold, despite the rain, despite the fact that this was the closest he had ever deliberately placed himself to her. "What were you thinking about?" he asked. "Staying," she said. The word landed in the space between them like a stone into still water. She watched the ripple of it move across his face, the careful stillness he usually wore disturbed, just briefly, into something unguarded. "You have a grant," he said. "A career. A life elsewhere." "I have a grant that renews if I reapply," Elara said. "I have a career I can conduct from anywhere with decent internet and forest access. And I have a life I've spent 26 years building very deliberately and carefully, which has somehow felt, since the first night I crossed your boundary, like a room I had perfectly furnished and then realized I'd forgotten to put in any windows." He was looking at her. All the careful distance gone. Just the full, unshielded force of him, which was, she discovered, a considerable thing. "Elara," he said. "You don't have to say it," she said. "Nadia told me what it means for you, what you felt the moment I crossed the boundary. But I want you to understand, it's not just that. Whatever the mate bond means in your world, I didn't have a word for what I felt. I'm human. I don't have recognition or bond chemicals or whatever it is for wolves. I just had this." She pressed her hand flat against her sternum. "This constant pull," she said. "From the first night. Like something that was supposed to be here finally arrived, and now I can't imagine removing it." The rain came down. The Heartlight bloomed, brighter than she'd ever seen it, pooling around them both. Cassian was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was lower than usual, stripped of its careful construction. "If you stay," he said, "it isn't simple. The pack has to accept you. There are people who won't understand. There are territorial politics and external threats, and the kind of complications that don't fit in a research waiver. I know, Elara said. I can't promise it will be easy. Cassian. She looked at him directly. I crossed a boundary into a wolf territory at 9 p.m. because I wanted a mushroom sample. Easy has never once been my metric. He looked at her for a long moment, and then, slowly, completely, transforming his face into something she'd never seen and would never forget, he smiled. Not the almost smile, not the ghost of one. The real thing, unguarded and warm and slightly helpless, like it had gotten out before he could decide whether to allow it. His hand reached out. It covered hers in the wet grass. The heartlight blazed. 3 weeks after the rain, 2 weeks after Cassian had formally introduced Elara to the full pack as someone under his personal protection, a moment that had gone roughly as well as introducing a new element to an established ecosystem always goes, the Valen pack arrived. They came on a Thursday afternoon, for wolves in human form, led by a man named Dreist, who had the particular smoothness of someone who had practiced being dangerous for so long it had become his resting expression. He was lean and pale, with a smile that reached nowhere near his eyes, and he looked at Elara with the specific interest of someone who had already decided how he intended to use her. The territorial dispute, laid out with studied courtesy in Cassian's front room, concerned a strip of southern Ashgrove land that Dreist claimed had been promised to the Valen pack before Cassian's father died. Land he'd been content to leave alone, he said, until recent events suggested that Ashgrove's leadership might benefit from external review. Your alpha's judgment has become questionable, Dreist said pleasantly, his eyes moving to Elara and staying there. Introducing a human into wolf territory, giving her access to sacred sites, claiming she's his fated mate. He spread his hands. The neighboring packs find it irregular. What the Valen pack finds irregular is not my concern, Cassian said. He had not moved from his position by the window. His arms were crossed. He sounded like a man describing the weather. It becomes everyone's concern, Dreist said, leaning forward slightly, when an alpha is so distracted by an outsider that his judgment can no longer be trusted to protect his own. We're calling for a formal challenge. Ashgrove land under new leadership, someone who understands that pack comes before sentiment. The room went completely still. Elara felt Reese go rigid beside her. She felt Nadia's hand close around her arm, not urgently, but with the quiet preparedness of someone ready to move. Dreist smiled at Cassian with all the warmth of a winter window. Blood moon, he said. 3 nights from now. Or Ashgrove cedes the southern strip by formal compact. Your choice, Alpha. Cassian looked at him. Elara had spent weeks learning to read Cassian's silences, and this one was doing a great deal of work. She watched him calculate options, costs, the weight of 63 lives on every variable, and she watched him arrive, with the expression of a man swallowing something bitter, at the only answer he could give. The Blood Moon challenge is accepted, Cassian said. He found her on the porch of her cabin that night, and she let him in without asking why he'd come, and they sat in front of the fire she'd built and didn't talk about the challenge for a long time. Eventually, she asked him to explain it. Combat, he said. Wolf form. It ends in submission, or when one of us can no longer continue. Elara looked at the fire. When one of you can no longer continue, she repeated carefully. It's rare, Cassian said. Modern packs don't typically.
But possible, she said.
He didn't answer. Which was an answer. I know Dreist's methods, Cassian said. I've fought him before. I know where he's fast and where he isn't. I'm not going to lose. That isn't the same thing as it not being possible to lose, Elara said. No, he admitted. It isn't. He came around the fire. He sat beside her, the same deliberateness he'd had in the rain, the careful choosing of proximity that meant something because of how rarely he did it. If something happens, he said, Reese takes the pack. The pack protects you. I need you to know that you'll be. If you say safe, Elara said, I'm going to be very irritated with you. Cassian stopped. I don't care about safe, she said. I care about you. You, specifically. Coming back. He was very still. I know, he said quietly. That's the most terrifying thing anyone has ever said to me. Get used to it, Elara told him. He reached up. His thumb traced along her jaw, and she held still, and the fire burned low between them. I'll come back, he said. I promise. You'd better, she said. I've barely finished the Northern Quadrant survey, and I need the access. He laughed. Actually laughed. Low and warm and involuntary, the kind of laugh a person didn't plan. She felt it like something loosening in the room. His forehead came to rest against hers. They sat like that, breathing the same air, while the fire talked to itself and the forest stood quiet outside. She memorized it,
Cataloged it.
filed it under things she intended to keep. The blood moon rose swollen and red over Ashgrove territory, and Elara stood at the edge of the challenge ring with Nadia's hand on her arm and the entirety of the Ashgrove pack at her back, and felt, with complete clarity, that she would never be ordinary again. She was not afraid. She was aware that she probably should be, and that this lack of fear would have seemed incomprehensible to the version of herself who had stood at the boundary marker 8 weeks ago debating whether to trespass for fungi samples. That version of herself had not yet stood in a heartlight clearing, had not yet had a teenage wolf ask her 600 questions in a row about human emotional processing, had not yet sat in firelight with a man who looked like he'd been carved from the landscape and laughed, really, helplessly laughed, because she'd told him to get used to being loved. She'd gotten there eventually. The two alphas met at the center of the ring in human form. Drea said something she couldn't hear at that distance. Cassian listened to it without expression. Then he looked across the ring, through the crowd, past Reese and Nadia and 60 other wolves, directly at Elara. One look. Steady and certain, and absolutely unafraid. Then the moon took them both. She'd seen wolves before. She'd seen Reese shift. She thought she'd known what to expect. She hadn't. Cassian in wolf form was huge and dark as smoke and moved with the same absolute economy he carried as a man. Nothing wasted. Everything deliberate. Every movement the product of something deep and old and completely sure of itself. And even across the ring, even changed, his eyes found hers in the crowd. Still gray. Still him. The fight was brutal, and she isn't going to pretend otherwise. Dreas was fast, genuinely fast and ruthless in the way that people who enjoy combat always are. He drew blood twice in the first 4 minutes. The second time, Elara stopped breathing. Beside her, she felt Nadia go still in the particular way of someone controlling themselves very carefully. But Cassian was patient. It was the first thing she'd understood about him, the quality she'd learned before anything else, that all that stillness was not absence. It was accumulated force. It was the power of a person who had long ago learned that the moment you moved, the moment you truly committed, you had to be certain. When he moved once. It was enough. Drea submitted in the 9th minute. The sound of it, the posture of it, the long, tense beat of silence before the watching pack exhaled, was something she would carry for a very long time. The Valen delegation was off Ashgrove territory before dawn, and Elara crossed the ring with precisely no regard for protocol, because protocol had apparently ceased to apply to her, and she put both hands against the enormous dark wolf's head and said, "I told you." Cassian shifted back. He was bleeding from his shoulder and his side, and he was exhausted, and he looked at her like she was the funniest and most exasperating thing he'd ever encountered, and then he laughed. The Real laugh, the helpless one, rough and warm, the kind that had been getting out of him more and more often these days whether he intended it or not. Behind them, Kit let out a whoop loud enough to startle every owl in the forest. Reese said something that sounded like a reprimand, and very much was not. Nadia, standing at the edge of the ring, looked at the sky with the expression of someone choosing, with great effort, not to say "I told you so." Cassian's hand found Elara's wrist. His thumb pressed against her pulse. She let him. Elara's grant renewed in October. She reapplied for a long-term extension on the Mycological Documentation Project. Anomalous bioluminescent cluster, Pacific Northwest, significant ongoing scientific interest. Approved within a week. The research community was, frankly, fascinated. She suspected she'd be filing quarterly reports on the Heartlight clearing for the next decade, minimum. She didn't live in the rental cabin anymore. The cabin on the eastern edge of Ashgrove territory, the one that backed up against the tree and smelled of pine resin and wood smoke, had more room. Better light. A second bedroom she'd converted into a sample lab, which Cassian had built her the shelving for without being asked, appearing one Saturday morning with timber and a measuring tape, and the resigned expression of a man who had accepted that lab shelving was now part of his life. Nadia had done the formal introduction to the pack with considerably more ceremony than Elara had expected, and considerably less drama. Most of the pack, it turned out, had already made up their minds. Kit had been campaigning on her behalf for weeks. The mornings were the best part. One morning, 3 months after the blood moon, frost on the windows, coffee on the stove, Kit at the kitchen table with his boots on the chair despite repeated requests to the contrary, he was in the middle of a new thread of inquiry. "Okay, but I genuinely need to understand," Kit said, completely seriously, leaning forward with his elbows on the table. "When humans fall in love, like before any of the proper bond chemicals have activated, you're just operating on vibes. You can't smell the attraction compounds or the attachment indicators. You feel some feelings and then you just guess that the other person also has feelings and hope for the best." "Essentially," Elara said. Kit stared at her. "That is the most chaotic system I have ever heard of," he said. "How does your species survive?" Cassian, across the table, turned a page of the territorial survey he was reviewing. Without looking up, he said, "Some things don't need to be measured to be known." Kit made an extremely undignified sound and announced that they were disgusting and he was leaving, and the door banged behind him hard enough to rattle the window frame. The kitchen was quiet. Morning light lay across the floor. Outside, the tree was silver and still. Cassian set down the survey and looked at her across the table. That look, the one she'd catalogued and filed and was still discovering new things in, the one that had no taxonomy because some things resisted it. "Still not afraid?" he asked. It was a joke, almost. Their joke, by now. Elara leaned across the table and pressed a kiss to the corner of his mouth. "Of this," she said. "Never. Of you? Also never." She settled back in her chair and picked up her coffee. "Of Kit's future role running this pack, and what that means for the next 30 years? Genuinely terrified." Cassian considered this. "Same," he said. She laughed. He almost smiled. Outside, in the frost-silver morning, the forest was breathing, steady and old and full of things she hadn't catalogued yet, things she intended to spend a very long time learning. She had the time. She had all the time. They say the full moon is when the walls between worlds grow thin. They never tell you that's actually a gift. That some walls don't exist to keep danger out. They exist to keep us from the wild, luminous, completely uncontrollable lives we might actually want, if we were brave enough to cross the line and find them. Elara Voss crossed one boundary on one ordinary October night with a field kit and no expectations and found something that didn't fit in any of her notebooks. Something she couldn't give a Latin name or a taxonomy or a controlled, rational category.
She found it anyway.
And in a clearing full of heartlight, under a blood moon that rose red over old-growth forest, in a territory that had waited, longer than anyone remembered, for exactly her to arrive. She stayed. If this story pulled you in, hit the subscribe button right now. Every single week I post full werewolf romance stories, paranormal audio dramas, and fated mate tales exactly like this one, and I don't want you to miss a single one. Drop a comment and tell me your favorite part. Were you here for Cassian's slow burn walls coming down one brick at a time, or were you, honestly, in it for Kit's chaos energy from the minute he showed up? I read every comment, genuinely.